General David Petraeus was director of the CIA from 2011 to 2012. After a 37-year career in the US Army, he commanded US forces in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I asked him whether these comments from Donald Trump were helpful.
What I think would be most helpful at this point in time would be for all of our countries together, US, all NATO nations, and other Western nations that cherish the same freedoms for which Ukraine is fighting, to come together and provide so much additional assistance to Ukraine, huge amount of additional security assistance, also more financial and economic and humanitarian assistance, that Ukraine can finally, on the battlefield, prove to Putin that he cannot achieve additional gains at remotely acceptable costs. And then, and only then, would I think you find that Russia might actually be willing to negotiate seriously. I'm not sure that diplomatic entreaties or trying to treat him with respect will necessarily do the trick.
You talk about President Trump's tactics. I want to ask you about President Zelensky's tactics. How significant is it that they were able to create so much damage to Russia without any help?
It's extraordinarily significant. They are on the bleeding edge of technology, especially when it comes to unmanned systems of all types. Again, keep in mind that Ukraine doesn't have a navy, and yet they've sunk 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet using a combination of aerial drones to find the Russian ships and maritime drones to sink them. They're going to make, they say, anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5 million drones this year alone. So heavy artillery still matters, cluster munitions still matter. And by the way, the UK should withdraw from both the anti-personnel landmine and conventional improved conventional munitions, cluster munitions conventions, as I argued at the policy exchange a week or so ago, because those have become important again. If you're going to defend the Baltic states, those will have to be employed. But what Ukraine is doing is, again, tomorrow's technology for today's war, where most of our procurement systems tend to produce yesterday's technology for tomorrow's war.
So Zelensky's fighting tomorrow's war then?
Very much so. I was reassured to hear Lord Robertson and Fiona Hill and General Sir Richard Barron's, all longtime friends, by the way, enormous respect for each of them, to hear them note that they have very much learned from what's going on in Ukraine, because this is the location in the world where you can most see what the future of warfare will look like, at least in this kind of situation, a land warfare, which would obviously be very different from, say, what might happen in the Indo-Pacific or other places.
Let's talk about the diplomatic tactics for President Zelensky now. He's walking something of a tightrope, isn't he, between, on the one hand, appearing the victim of aggression, therefore needing the support of allies, something that he's obviously continued to appeal for. But then in attacking Russia, as happened last weekend, he in turn risks incurring the wrath of Donald Trump, who, of course, is the one man closest to the means of forcing peace. What should he do? Well, it is a tightrope, isn't it?
It is. Of course it is. And of course, this has been present all the way along. Remember, the previous White House was very concerned about the possibility of escalation to tactical nuclear weapons. You remember that was the reason that they repeatedly delayed approving the delivery of certain weapon systems. And at various times, there was a lot of discussion of that. I remember being on CNN on a Sunday morning in a show, what would the U.S. do if Russia employed tactical nuclear weapons, and offered a couple of the possibilities as response. Over time, I think we've come to see that that kind of escalation is probably quite unlikely.
Now, I know, have been to Ukraine recently. What's the morale like on the ground? What do you think, for those military figures you spoke to there, what should be their approach?
Well, I think they're actually employing exactly the right approach, because they're constantly learning. It's the drone now that is that has changed the very nature of warfare on the front lines in Ukraine. Russian tanks can't survive anymore. Armored personnel carriers can't survive. Anything that comes out into the open in that no man's land that often exists between the front lines of the respective forces has a very short lifespan if it can't quickly get to. This is why the Russians now are experimenting with electric motorcycles, because there's no noise associated with them, and they figure they can maneuver fast enough that a drone can't hit them. Well, actually, the pilots of these first-person view drones and so forth can absolutely take them out. So unless the weather is really foul, the ubiquitous surveillance that is always over these front lines, from both sides, I should add, is going to identify any movement and very quickly target it with these first-person suicide drones, if you will. And we need to be learning much more from this. This is actually, my last trip was the 6th since the invasion, noting that I was sanctioned by Putin in the fall of the first year, and have watched this tremendous leap forward every single time we visit. But again, we need to learn very, very much from this. And I'm a bit worried that we're not, because of sensitivity to boots on the ground, and most in my country in particular, noting that it's publicly known that the British have been willing to take a good bit more risk, and I think commendably and admirably, with some of the elements that are on the ground there.
General Petraeus talking to me a little bit earlier.